Chapter 2 of The Adventures of a Grain of Dust by Hallam Hawksworth. This Librivox Recording is in the public domain. February. Behold a strange monster our wonder engages, if dolphin or lizard your wit may defy. Some 30 feet long, on the shore of Lyme Regis. What a saw for a jaw, and a big staring eye! A fish or a lizard? An Ichthyosaurus, with a big goggle eye and a very small brain, and paddles like mill wheels in chattering chorus, smiting tremendous the dread-sounding mane. Professor Blackie. Some Early Settlers and Their Bones. But a farm where nothing but plants grow isn't much of a farm. Every good farmer knows that nowadays, and so he stocks his place with horses and cows and chickens and things. Mother Nature understood this principle from the beginning, and the plants and animals on her farm have always got on well together. For one thing, the plant and the animal each help the other to get its breath. That is to say, plants, when they take in the air, keep most of the carbon there is in it and give back most of the oxygen, which is just what the animal world wants, while the animals, when they breathe, keep most of the oxygen and give back most of the carbon, just the thing that plants grow on. But the service of the animals to the plants is very important after they have stopped breathing altogether, since their flesh and bones, like the dead bodies of the plants, go back to enrich their common dust. The bones and bodies and shells of members of the animal kingdom, however, are far richer food for soils than is dead vegetation. The shell creatures of the sea, to which we owe our wonderfully fertile limestone soils, are, many of them, so small that you can only make them out with a microscope, while certain other contributors to our food supply are so big that one of them, walking down a country road, would almost fill the road from fence to fence. 1. Mr. Dinosaur and his Neighbors. A strange face in the meadow. Now let's take a look at some of these big fellows. How would you like to have such a creature as the one at the right of this page come ambling up to meet you at the meadow gate of an evening when you went to milk the cows? Yet more than likely either this gentle animal or some of his kin browsed over the very field where now the cattle pasture, for he, too, was a grass-eater, and with an appetite most hearty. If you kept him in a barn, his stall would have to be 80 feet long, and it would be necessary to fill his rack with a ton of fodder every 3rd day. But assuming there was a market for him in the shape of steaks and roasts, you would be well repaid, for in prime condition he weighed 20 tons. These monsters who ate grass, and other monsters who ate them, and still other monsters who lived in the sea, appeared comparatively late in the life of the world. Tons and tons of ancient bones. It is only about 15 million years ago, for example, that the biggest of them all, the dinosaurs, lived, while the earth itself is now supposed to be some 100 million years old. Their numbers were enormous, and it is probable there is not an acre of ground from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and from Alaska to the tip end of South America, that has not been fertilized by their bones. In fact, of certain species I have found the bones scattered all the way from Oregon to Patagonia, so this must have been their pasture. They were not only all over the land, but in the lakes and in the great sea that once extended right through North America from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic Ocean. And they were along the shores of the sea and in the swamps. The bones of the ancestors of the whale were found in such quantities in some of the southern states that they were used to build fences until it was found they were much more valuable to enrich the fields themselves. In the great American inland sea of those days swam one kind of fierce fish lizard that took such big bites he had to have a hinge in his jaw. Because of this hinge, he could open his mouth wider without putting anything out of place, don't you see? He was called the mesosaur. But he never bit the archelon, who was in his crowd, because he couldn't. The archelon was the king of turtles, and like all the turtle family, wore heavy armor. He was over 12 feet long. And sharks, no end of them. A shark at his best is bad enough, but the sharks of those days were almost too terrible to think about. Such jaws, and teeth like railroad spikes. Then there was a great-toothed diving creature with wings. They've named him Hesperornis, which means western bird. He was given the name because the fossils of the best-known species were found in the chalk beds of Kansas. Over the waters flew another bird-like, fish-like, bat-like thing called the pterodactyl. Look at his picture and you will see how he got his nickname. It means finger-toe. What is our little finger was the longest of his 5 digits. It helped support and operate that big bat-like wing extending from his arms to his toes. He was the largest of all flying machines until the days of the Wright brothers. It was over 20 feet across his wings from tip to tip. And like the Hesperornis, he also had fish for dinner. The earliest rulers of the sea. The first monsters, like the first of almost anything else, including the land itself, were in the sea. For a time, giant fish, armor-plated like a man of war and with awful appetites, just about ran everything. Then came the reign of the sharks. Some of them had jaws that opened to the height of a door, 6 feet or over. Next in succession, as rulers of the sea, were the fish lizards, of whom that hinge-jawed mesosaur was one. Of another of these fish lizards, a famous teacher of Edinburgh University, Professor Blackie, wrote that funny verse at the head of this chapter. The bones of this particular specimen were found sticking out of a cliff at Lyme Regis, a popular watering place in the English Channel, by a pretty English girl who was strolling along the beach. The Ichthyosaurus, as Professor Blackie says in his verse, was some 30 feet long, with a comparatively large head, like an alligator's, set close to his body. Another fish lizard, well and unfavorably known by his neighbors of the sea, was the Plesiosaurus. Instead of fins, he had big paddles resembling those of a seal. He was a kind of side-wheeler, like the Mississippi River steamboats, and he could go like everything. His neck was long, and he darted after the smaller creatures he lived on. Reign of the lizard family. But these queer fish seem to have just been getting ready to land, for, by being lizards, they after a while managed it. A lizard, you know, belongs to the reptile family, and out of these sea reptiles there grew, in course of time, reptiles who lived, not in the sea, but in the swamps along the sea. These reptiles were the dinosaurs, and they are related to the Minosaurs and the Ichthyosaurus, and the rest of the saurs, as you can see by the family name, for saur means lizard. Dinosaur means terrible lizard. Don't you think he looks it? Although some of these dinosaurs were no larger than chickens, others were by far the largest creatures that ever were, on sea or land. Many of the biggest lived on grass, just like an old cow, while the flesh-eating dinosaurs lived on them. Some of these dinosaurs went on all fours, while others ran about on their hind legs, and when they stood still, propped themselves up on their big, thick tails, as do kangaroos. The Cantasaurus, one of whose favorite resorts was the land that is now Wyoming, was 30 feet long. Another, called the Brontosaurus, was 60 feet long. The Atlantosaurus, one of the pioneers of Colorado, measured 80 feet from the end of his nose to the end of his tail, and all of them were built in proportion. The Stegosaurus, also an early settler in Wyoming, had huge bony plates, like plowshares, sticking out all along his back from the nape of his neck to the end of his tail. He seems to have gone about looking quite ugly and humpbacked, as our old cat does when she has words with the dog. Quite aside from the fact that he had so little brain to worry with, it seems highly improbable that the Stegosaurus ever felt any apprehension about attacks from the rear, in the frequent military operations which distinguished the times in which he lived. In addition to the horny plates down his back, he had those horny spines, which were swung by a tail some 10 feet long. After the swamps dried up, and the lizards could no longer make a living, came the reign of the mammals, including the mastodons and the mammoths, marching in countless herds, trumpeting through the forests. How some monsters plowed the field. But besides what they did in the way of fertilizing the land with their flesh and bones, some of the mammals did a good deal of plowing. Among these early plowmen were the mastodons and the mammoths, and another elephant-like creature with 2 tusks, which he wore, not after the fashion among elephants today, but curving down from his chin, somewhat like Uncle Sam's goatee. He used these tusks, it is supposed, not only for self-defense, but for grubbing up roots which he ate. If so, they must have been about as good plows as those crooked sticks that were used by the early farmers among men, and that are still in use among primitive peoples. The elephant family as plowmen. What makes it more likely that the creature with the down-curving tusk stirred the soil with them is that his cousins, the elephants of today, are themselves great plowmen. Elephants feed not only on grass and the tender shoots of trees, but on bulbs buried in the soil, which they hunt out by their fine sense of smell. In digging these bulbs they turn up whole acres of ground. Elephants also do a great deal of plowing by uprooting trees so as to make it more convenient to get at their tender tops. Sir Samuel Baker, the explorer, says the work done by a herd of elephants in a mimosa forest in this way is very great, and that trees over 4 feet in circumference are uprooted. In the case of the biggest trees, several elephants work together, some pulling the tree with their trunks, while others dig under the roots with their tusks. To be sure, the mimosa trees have no taproots, but tearing them out of the ground is no small job, nevertheless. It takes strength and it takes engineering. Another early plowman was a bird, the moa. The moa had no wings, but his muscular legs were simply enormous, and so were his feet. New Zealand seems to have been the headquarters of the moas. There used to be loads of them, as shown by the huge deposits of their bones. They are supposed to have been killed in countless numbers during the ice ages in the southern hemisphere. For there were ice ages in the southern as well as the northern hemisphere. In one great morass in New Zealand, abounding in warm springs, bones of the moas were found in such countless numbers, layer upon layer, that it is thought the big birds gathered at these springs to keep warm during those great freezes. The millstones of the moas. Besides the work they did with feet and bills, you may imagine how much nice fresh stone the moas must have ground up in their crops during the millions of years they existed. It was a regular mill, the gizzard of a moa, full of pebbles as big as hickory nuts. Scattered about the springs where their bones are found are little heaps of these pebbles, each the contents of a gizzard. Like miniature tumuli, they mark the spots where the bodies of the moas return to dust. Perhaps some of those flesh-eating dinosaurs did a little plowing once in a while, too. For one theory is that those ridiculous little arms were used for scratching out a nest for the eggs, just as the crocodiles and the alligators and the turtles dig nests for their eggs today. For all these animals, as did the dinosaurs, belong to the reptile family, and show the family trait of digging out nests for their eggs. Although the dinosaurs roamed the swamps and lowlands of all the ancient world, their favorite resort was the territory now occupied by our western states, judging from the quantity of bones they left, while that old Mediterranean sea of ours was full of their kin, the sea lizards. Professor Marsh, of Yale, who was among the first explorers of the graves of these monarchs of the past, says that one day, while riding through a valley in the Rocky Mountains, he saw the bones of no less than 7 sea lizards staring at him from the cliffs. Yet only here and there, by the wearing through of the rocks by flowing streams, has nature opened up these vast mausoleums, the mountains and the cliffs. What enormous quantities of bones, then, must still be buried there! What tons and tons must have given their lime and phosphate to the soil! So you see, this story of old bones, even from a farming standpoint, is no light matter. By their marvelous skill and their knowledge of the mechanics of monster anatomy, the paleontologists fit one bone fragment to another, supply the missing parts in artificial material, and behold, the monsters take their places in the long procession of the ages. There has been nothing equal to it since the vision of the prophet in the Valley of Dry Bones. Ezekiel 37, 1-10. 2. How the monsters died and returned to dust. But you said these monsters lived in the sea and in swamps. Then how, in the name of common sense, did their bones end up in the mountains? When the inland sea went dry. Well, it's like this. As I said a while back, in the days of the monster fish and the monster lizards, there was a great sea reaching clear from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic Ocean, and with swamps along the borders extending far into lands that afterward became the Rocky Mountains. When the land began to rise, due to the shrinking of the earth, a thing that has been going on ever since the earth was born, the sea and the swamps went dry, and far to the west the land wrinkled up into the Rocky Mountains. In these layers of rocks that made the mountains were the bones of the monsters that had died when the rocks were still mud, in the swamps and along the borders of the inland sea. Not only did the land under the western portion of the sea slowly rise until the waters were completely closed in on the west, and the sea thus made that much narrower, but the rise of the land on the south cut off connection with the great salt ocean which surrounds the continents today. So the saltwater fish, for lack of salt water, died, and with them the monsters like the Ichthyosaurus that lived on the saltwater fish that lived in this salt sea. But it wasn't alone that the seas grew narrower and more shallow because of the elevation of the lands. The mountains rising in the west cut off the rain-laden winds which blew from the Pacific in those days, just as they do now. Thus the seas dried up so much the faster. But first, before the sea went entirely dry, its place was taken by the lakes and swamps into which it shriveled up. Low, swampy land is just what reptiles like, so this was their golden age, just as the previous time of the wide, deep sea was the golden age of the big fish and the fish lizards. Then, as the land still rose and the climate grew drier, the reptiles passed away, and in came the mammal family, to which the cows and the horses and the cats and the kittens and all the rest of us belong. Too much brawn, too little brain. Of course, even where they didn't die with their boots on, so to speak, as so many of them did in those lawless days, there came a time for each monster, in the order of nature, when he drew his last breath. But what seems so strange is that all these monsters, the biggest and strongest of them, entirely disappeared and left no descendants. That is to say, no descendants worthy of them. It is now thought some of the modern reptiles may be degenerate descendants of the big reptiles of old. The whole mystery has not been unraveled yet, even by the wise men of science, but still they have learned a good deal. For one thing, they know that most of the reptiles and the fish lizards disappeared because so much of the land where they lived went dry. They had to get a new boarding place, and there wasn't any to get. Another thing was that these big fellows, although they were so big, and got along finely while everything was just so, had so little brain they couldn't change their habits to meet new conditions, as our closer and cleverer cousins, the mammals, did. Why, do you know that one of these monsters, who was 25 feet long if he was an inch, and 12 feet high, had a brain no bigger than a man's fist? All the monsters of those days were like that, tons of bone and muscle, but a very small supply of brains. So when things went against them, they just had to give up, and like a queer dream, they faded away. But their history makes one of the most interesting chapters in the whole wonderful story of the dust. Of all the livestock that have fed on the great world farm and helped enrich it with their bones, these animals were surely the strangest that ever were seen. Hide and seek in the library. But since these monsters passed away many millions of years ago, and all that is usually found is a piece of them here and there, how do the men of science know so much about them, how they looked, how they ate, and how they treated one another? That's a good question. It does seem strange. Why, to hear them talk, you'd suppose these men, learned in ancient bones, had actually met the monsters. And speaking of meeting them, I must tell you a little story. It's a good story, and it will answer your question. Baron Cuvier, one of the most famous of the paleontologists, awoke from a deep sleep to see standing by his bed a strange, hairy creature with horns and hoofs, and it said, "Cuvier, Cuvier, I have come to eat you." But the Baron, taking in the form of the monster at a glance, only laughed. "Horns and hoofs? You can't, you're a grain-eater." See the point? The Baron argued that because the monster had horns and hoofs, he must be a grain-eater, for all creatures with both horns and hoofs are grain-eaters. This particular creature, to be sure, was an eater of both meat and grain, being one of Cuvier's students who was trying to play a trick on him. But the principle holds good. The scientists, knowing one thing, infer another. Because animals with both horns and hoofs eat no meat, Cuvier knew his visitor couldn't eat him, even if he'd been real and not just made up. For another instance, take our queer old friend that Professor Blackie wrote the funny rhyme about, the Ichthyosaurus, with a saw for a jaw and a big staring eye. The scientists figure, just from looking into the hollow socket where the eye used to be, that he could see at night like a cat, and right through muddy water, too, that he spent most of his time in shallows near the shore, that it didn't make any difference to him whether a fish was near or far, provided it wasn't too far, of course, for he could see it and catch it just the same. They also said, these learned men, after peering into the dark hollow where that remarkable eye used to be, that Mr. Ichthyosaurus spent a great deal of time diving and a great deal of time with his homely face just above the surface of the water. Why they could reason all this from a hollow eye socket and some bony, flexible plates around the outer edge of it, you will see by referring to such books as Animals of the Past by F.A. Lucas, director of the American Museum of Natural History, Creatures of Other Days and Extinct Monsters by Hutchinson, Extinct Animals by Lancaster, Mighty Animals by Mix, the chapter Where the World Was Young in Lang's Red Book of Animal Stories, and Restoring Prehistoric Monsters in Uncle Sam, Wonder Worker by Dupuy. Here are some more conclusions they draw from certain facts. See how near you can come to reasoning them out for yourself before looking them up in the books that tell. Why is it supposed the dinosaurs swam like crocodiles? Look at the picture of Mr. I and pay particular attention to his tail. Why is it they say that the sea lizards with long necks must have had small heads? Why is it argued that because the Mesosaurus had a hinge in his jaw, he must have had a big, loose, baggy throat? Keeping Up the Soil in the Country Life Reader deals with the subject of the use of fertilizers on the farm, how easy it is to waste them, how easy it is to save them, and how important it is they should be saved, while the article on Acid Soils tells how the lime in the bones of the monsters has helped keep the soil from getting sour stomach, and also how they unlocked the potash and phosphorus in the soil so that the plants could get at them. End of Chapter 2.